The galaxy had always been a place of endless diversity, filled with countless species, civilizations, and histories, stretching across the vastness of space. It was a place where the powerful ruled, where those who could conquer and adapt thrived. The Federation, a loose coalition of hundreds of different species, had been the unquestioned dominant force for centuries. Their peace was a fragile one, held together by mutual agreements, strict codes of conduct, and a set of regulations that governed everything from trade to conflict. War, as the Federation understood it, was a highly controlled, almost clinical thing. It was regulated by laws, by diplomats, by complex systems of treaties and alliances. A breach of the rules was punished swiftly. War crimes were anathema at first glance. Violations of the natural order that ensured the galaxy's stability. Their planet, Earth, was located on the outer fringes of known space, a barely noticeable speck in the cosmic expanse. Their technology was just advanced enough to make them notable, but not yet dangerous. The Federation had seen such species before, civilizations in their infancy, struggling to survive on their homeworlds, still wrestling with their internal conflicts, far from capable of engaging on a galactic scale. The humans had made their first tentative forays into space travel just a few hundred years ago. Their ships, crude by galactic standards, but functional. They had no allies beyond their own kind, no vast empire to speak of. They were simply another species, one more to add to the list of potential future members of the Federation. Or so the Federation thought. When the first human delegation arrived in Federation space, the Federation Council was unimpressed. A group of diplomats and scientists had been sent to negotiate a peaceful introduction to galactic affairs, to engage with the galaxy's established powers and begin the process of integration. In the Federation's eyes, the humans were a young species with potential, but still a far cry from being a threat. They sent representatives who were calm, methodical, and measured, representatives who would, in the eyes of the Federation, follow the protocols, agree to the regulations, and eventually be assimilated into the fold. But then, the humans had sent their Marines. The first of these human Marines to make contact was Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was a veteran of countless battles on Earth, a man whose experience in warfare was unmatched. His demeanor was nothing like the polished, diplomatic grace of the Federation's representatives. He wore no formal attire, no pristine uniform. His combat fatigues were worn and scuffed, a testament to the countless missions he had endured. His eyes, cold and unflinching, were not the eyes of a negotiator, but of a man who had seen and survived the brutal realities of combat. When he entered the meeting room on Azathoth 3, the Federation representatives, all highly trained diplomats and scholars, were stunned into silence. The humans had come for a peaceful negotiation, they thought. Yet here was a warrior, a man whose presence seemed to suggest that the stakes were far higher than they had anticipated. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but it quickly became apparent that Mercer had no interest in the Federation's formalities. He sat, arms crossed, his gaze unwavering as the Federation officials spoke of their vision for peace, cooperation, and the shared future of the galaxy. To them, these were grand ideas, the very foundation of their existence. But to Mercer, they were nothing more than the hollow promises of an empire that had long forgotten the price of peace. The words of the Federation fell on deaf ears, and as Mercer listened, he began to understand just how naive they were. They thought him harmless, they thought humanity harmless, but they had no idea what they were dealing with. The Federation had always prided itself on its long-standing peace. For centuries, its diverse members had lived in harmony, each species adhering to a strict set of laws that prohibited the horrors of war. These laws were the foundation of their collective identity, and they believed themselves to be the moral guardians of the galaxy. The concept of war crimes, deeply ingrained in Federation society, was more than a set of legal guidelines. It was an ethos, a belief that even in conflict, the innocent must be protected and the rules of war must be followed. In the Federation's eyes, any species that failed to adhere to these principles would eventually be eliminated, either through assimilation or, if necessary, military action. So when the humans arrived, the Federation expected them to fit within the mold. Their first contact with humanity was a simple one, a diplomatic meeting with representatives from the United Nations and the newly formed Interstellar Council. The humans were still primitive by galactic standards, their technology still in its infancy compared to the mighty Federation. But they were eager to join the fold, and why not? The Federation offered peace, prosperity, and a place in a galactic community that was far superior to anything humanity could accomplish alone. At least, that was the Federation's perspective. The diplomats were polite, and the negotiations began with an exchange of gifts, symbols of goodwill between species. A Federation ambassador handed over a gleaming, holographic artifact that represented their commitment to peace. The humans, in return, offered a piece of their own history, a flag, worn and tattered, but a symbol of their survival and unity as a species. The gesture was strange, but it seemed to be received with equal reverence. Yet, despite the seemingly cordial atmosphere, something felt off to the Federation's leaders. The humans had sent their Marines, and that was where things took a sharp turn. While the diplomats exchanged pleasantries, the Marines, specifically Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer, had come along for a different purpose. He wasn't there for speeches or formalities. He wasn't there to discuss trade routes or scientific endeavors. Mercer's role was simple: to represent humanity's might, their readiness to defend their own, and, if necessary, to fight for survival. To the Federation's representatives, Mercer was aware of their dismissive stares, a relic of a bygone era, a barbarian in a world of countless meetings. Species from all over the galaxy thought humans were naive, untamed, incapable of grasping the true order of things. They didn't know the full extent of humanity's history, the wars, the suffering, the countless sacrifices that had been made for survival. To them, humans were still a raw, untapped resource. They thought humanity's violence was simply a phase, a passing thing that would eventually be outgrown. But Mercer knew better. He had seen war, real war, the kind that didn't care about diplomacy or the rules. He knew the depths to which humanity had sunk during the darkest times in history, and he also knew the lengths to which humans had gone to rise above it. Mercer remained silent, observing, never speaking unless directly addressed. His presence alone made the Federation's representatives uncomfortable, and the discomfort deepened as the hours passed. He wasn't an ambassador. He wasn't here to make deals or broker peace. He was a warrior, and everyone in the room felt the weight of that truth. To the Federation's leaders, who had long prided themselves on their regulated, well-ordered approach to galactic peace, the human military presence felt like a punch in the gut. And then it happened. At some point in the conversation, one of the Federation diplomats, a sharp-aimed diplomat from the Elephant species known for its intellect, brought up the topic of war crimes, assuming it was something humanity would soon adopt as part of the greater galactic order. The Federation's laws against war crimes were absolute. They were non-negotiable. Mercer leaned forward. The room fell silent as his piercing gaze swept over the gathered officials. War crimes, he repeated, his voice low and steady. You think we don't know about war crimes? The question hung in the air, thick with meaning. The Federation leaders exchanged uncertain glances, not sure where Mercer was going with this. They had expected the humans to fall in line, to learn the lessons of their history and abide by the laws they had so carefully constructed. But Mercer wasn't just talking about following the rules. He was talking about something else entirely. He was talking about what it meant to survive in a galaxy where rules could be bent and broken, where morality was a luxury some species simply couldn't afford. The Federation, in their arrogance, had thought humanity harmless. They thought they could indoctrinate them, shape them into another peaceful, regulated species. But as Mercer's eyes burned with the intensity of 100 lifetimes of struggle, it became clear. The humans were not here to follow the rules. They were here to write their own. The Federation had made a mistake. They hadn't just underestimated humanity. They had completely misjudged what they were dealing with, and they would soon learn that mistake could cost them everything. The meeting room fell into a tense silence as Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer's words echoed in the air. The Federation representatives looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had always prided themselves on their ability to handle delicate situations, their sharp minds able to navigate the most difficult of conversations. But this was something different, something they had never encountered before. A human, a mere human sitting in front of them, a military officer no less, talking as if he understood war on a deeper level than they ever could. Mercer's gaze didn't waver. His hands rested on the table, fingers steepled, as if the weight of centuries of human history were pressing down on him. The Federation, with all their regulations and rules, had never truly known what it meant to fight for survival, to fight with everything a species had and still lose. They had never been driven to the brink by a war that seemed impossible to win, a war that saw every last scrap of morality stripped away just to get through to the next day. "Let me tell you something about war crimes," Mercer continued, his voice slow and deliberate. "When humans go to war, we don't just follow rules because some lawmaker somewhere says we should. We do it because if we don't, we lose our souls. We lose everything that makes us human." The Federation's diplomats shifted uncomfortably. There was a certain gravitas in Mercer's voice, an authority that came from knowing the price of conflict all too well. They had expected him to be a simple soldier, a brute whose understanding of warfare would be limited to strategy and tactics. What they didn't expect was a man who spoke with the kind of moral weight that suggested humanity had a unique, terrifying understanding of war, one that had been forged in the fires of countless bloody battles. Mercer paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You think you can just come in here, offer us some shiny technology, and that we'll forget our history? You think that because we're primitive by your standards, we'll be eager to play nice?" He shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "You're wrong. Humanity has been through hell and back, and we've come out the other side. We've learned the hard way what it means to survive." The Federation representatives were beginning to look uneasy. They had prided themselves on their peaceful ways, their lofty ideals of diplomacy and negotiation. They had believed that all species, in time, would come to see the value of those principles. But here they were, faced with a human who not only didn't see the value of their carefully constructed order, but seemed to mock it entirely. Mercer wasn't interested in peace for peace's sake. He wasn't interested in appeasing the Federation's regulations. He was interested in survival. "We're not like you," Mercer said, leaning in slightly, his voice growing colder. "We've fought wars, real wars, wars that have torn our world apart, that have wiped out entire generations of our kind. But we didn't give up, and we didn't lose ourselves in the process. We created something stronger out of the rubble, a set of rules that we hold ourselves to, so that we never cross that line again. War crimes, as you call them, aren't just things we punish. They're things we fought to eliminate from our culture. But make no mistake, we know how to fight. We know how to win. And we'll fight to protect our people, our way of life, no matter the cost." The Federation's lead diplomat, a sleek, silver-skinned creature named Zarva, spoke up, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Colonel, we understand your history, But that doesn't mean we can simply allow a species like yours to operate without—" Mercer cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No, Jarva," he said, his voice firm. "You don't understand. You think your rules will work on us, that your sanitized version of war can be applied to humanity. But we've been through it all, and we've seen the truth. War isn't clean. It's brutal. It's unforgiving. And when the stakes are high enough, the line between right and wrong gets a whole lot blurrier." Zarva's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Mercer stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was imposing, even more so in person, and the room seemed to shrink as he took a few steps forward. "Rules," Mercer continued. "We're here to make our own path, to show the galaxy that survival doesn't come from playing it safe, from adhering to the comfortable structures you've built. It comes from doing whatever it takes to ensure that your people survive. And if that means breaking a few rules along the way, rules you've set in place to keep the galaxy in line, then that's what we'll do. Rules you've set in place to keep the galaxy in line, then that's what we'll do." The room was still. The Federation diplomats looked at each other, and for the first time, they began to question their assumptions. They had thought that the humans were a species they could control, that their warlike tendencies could be tempered by the Federation's laws. They had thought that humanity would eventually come to understand the importance of peace and diplomacy. What they hadn't counted on was that humanity's true strength lay not in following the rules, but in bending them, in refusing to be dictated to, and in doing whatever it took to protect their own. Mercer's eyes bored into them as the silence stretched on, his message clear. The Federation had miscalculated, and they were about to learn just how dangerous humanity could be when it was pushed to its limits. Mercer's words lingered in the air, heavy with a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. The Federation diplomats, who had once been confident in their ability to manage the encounter with humanity, were now visibly rattled. They had come expecting to meet a species that would be easily molded, easily guided into the fold of galactic order. What they had found instead was a human who carried with him the unshakable conviction of a people who had learned to survive not by the grace of peaceful treaties, but by sheer will and the scars of battle. The silence that followed Mercer's declaration was palpable. For a moment, the Federation representatives simply stared at him, struggling to reconcile their long-held beliefs about humanity with the stark reality in front of them. The ambassador, Zarva, struggled to find words. His species had been in existence for millennia, and never in all their years had they encountered anything like this. They had been told that humans were primitive, backward, that their wars were relics of a savage past. What they hadn't been told was that those wars had shaped a species capable of great survival, capable of understanding war on a level that made them more dangerous than any they had encountered. Species rise and fall over the centuries, but none like humanity. There had been others who had endured brutal conflicts, others who had faced extinction and come back stronger. But what the Federation hadn't realized was that humanity wasn't just about survival. They had a capacity for self-awareness, an awareness of their own brutal history that allowed them to rise above it. And they weren't just trying to survive. Humanity was now adapting in ways that made them a threat, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "Colonel Mercer, your words are unsettling," he said, his tone forced, a little too calm for someone who had just been confronted with a species that viewed war differently than anything the Federation had ever seen. "But we are still bound by the rules of the Federation. War crimes are not a mere suggestion. They are the foundation of our order. We cannot allow a species that does not follow these rules to..." "You're missing the point," Mercer cut him off again, his voice hardening, his patience wearing thin. "You keep talking about your order, your rules, as if they're the only things that matter. But those rules, Jarva, are what got you complacent. They're what made you believe that the galaxy could be held together with nothing but laws and treaties. Rules work when you have the luxury of peace, but when the stakes are life and death, when survival is the only thing that matters, you learn that rules are just paper, and paper burns. There was a slight tremor in Zarva's voice, though he tried to mask it. Are you saying you would abandon the very foundations of our galactic peace? That you would throw away everything that has kept the galaxy from falling into chaos? His gaze unwavering. I'm saying that you don't get it. The galaxy doesn't stay peaceful because everyone follows the rules. It stays peaceful because some species are willing to make the hard choices, the brutal ones, when the time comes. Humanity isn't here to fit into your neat little system. We're here to make sure that when the time comes, we can defend ourselves, and if necessary, make sure no one ever threatens us again. What? The room grew colder, the tension thickening like a physical presence. The Federation had believed that humanity would learn from their mistakes, that the lessons of their past wars would make them more compliant, more willing to live in harmony with others. But Mercer's words had made it clear that humanity was no longer interested in peace for peace's sake. They weren't interested in being shaped by the Federation. They were prepared to shape their own future, by whatever means necessary. For the first time in their long history, the Federation was forced to confront a reality they hadn't prepared for, a species that had learned from its wars, that had found strength not just in survival, but in the lessons of conflict, and that knowledge made them not just survivors, but predators. Mercer's expression softened for the first time in the meeting. Look, we're not looking for a fight, he said, his tone more measured now. We're not here to destroy everything you've built. But you need to understand something. Humanity isn't some helpless species you can push around. We've been through hell, and we've survived. We have the capacity to learn from our mistakes and adapt. And that makes us dangerous in ways you're not ready for. Zarva stood there, speechless for a moment, staring at the human who had just shattered everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. He had thought humanity was a naive species that could be guided into the fold, a species that could be managed with enough patience and education. But what Mercer had shown him was a deeper truth. Humanity was no longer a species to be educated or controlled. The alternative to exploitation was death, a death transferred by space travel and then redirected on Earth. They were a species that could, when pushed, fight with a ferocity and determination that could rival any empire in the galaxy. And that thought, that unsettling reality, made the Federation uneasy. The galaxy had just been introduced to something new, something terrifying, and they had no idea how to handle it. The real question was no longer whether humanity would join the Federation, but whether the Federation would survive the presence of humanity in the galaxy. The days following the meeting were filled with uncertainty. Across the Federation, news of the encounter with the humans spread like wildfire, sparking debates, urgent discussions, and a growing sense of unease among the leadership. Many Federation officials had been quietly disturbed by Mercer's words, but others, particularly the more senior members, were alarmed by the implications of his behavior. This wasn't just about a species joining the fold. It was about the fundamental nature of humanity itself. What they had seen in Mercer wasn't just a soldier or a diplomat, but a force of nature, a reflection of humanity's resilience and determination to forge its own path. Jarva, regardless of galactic from the encounter, convened a closed-door meeting with the Federation's highest council members. The Federation had long prided itself on its ability to manage peace, to regulate the behavior of its member species, and to maintain the fragile balance of power that had allowed the galaxy to thrive for centuries. But now, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, that balance seemed threatened. We underestimated them, Zarva began. his voice grave as he addressed the council. The large round table was filled with representatives from all corners of the Federation, each species more or less united in their belief that peace was the only path forward. But now, there was a crack in that unity. Zarava continued, "The humans have no interest in the established order. They refuse to be shaped by us. They will not conform to the expectations we've set." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The representative from the Gethi, a towering insectoid species, was the first to speak. "You speak of the humans as though they are an anomaly. Their history is violent, yes, but surely they are still a fledgling species. Why should we be so concerned? We can simply impose our laws, guide them to better ways." Zara shook his head, his expression darkening. "It's not that simple. They don't respond to pressure in the way other species do. We can't just guide them like we do with the lesser species we've encountered." The Lieutenant Colonel Mercer made that abundantly clear. "They are different. They're dangerous." "Dangerous?" the Gethi representative scoffed. "That's a strong word. You make it sound as though they are some kind of unstoppable force. They have barely a few hundred years of interstellar history, hardly enough time to challenge the might of the Federation." Jarva's eyes narrowed. "You're missing the point. The humans don't need hundreds of years. They are adaptable. They learned the lessons of war at a pace we can't fathom." In one short conversation, Mercer turned our very understanding of war and peace on its head. They are capable of tactics, of thinking outside the conventional boundaries, and they will fight to survive, no matter the cost. The room fell silent as those words sank in. It was true, of course. The Federation had fought wars before, even devastating wars that had reshaped entire sectors of the galaxy. But those wars were always conducted within the confines of rules, boundaries, and mutual understanding. The Federation had never fought an enemy like the humans, one that didn't value the same definitions of peace and order. The idea that the humans might fight without hesitation, without mercy, was an idea that sent a cold shiver down the spine of every representative present. Another member of the council, a sleek, sharp-eyed being from the Aelkai species, spoke up. "But surely they can't be allowed to roam free unchecked. If what Mercer says is true, if they are willing to fight to preserve their autonomy at all costs, what happens when they face other species? The entire galaxy Federation had spent centuries building a carefully structured society of laws and treaties, with the intent of preventing another galactic war like the one that had nearly destroyed them centuries ago. The thought that a species might throw all of that away, or worse, challenge it outright, was unthinkable. But now, with humans standing at the precipice, the Federation had to ask itself a question. Could they afford to let this species operate outside their framework? Zarva let the question linger in the air before answering. "We don't have a choice. We can't force them into submission, not after what we've seen. But we also can't allow them to operate as they please without consequence. We need to understand them better before they push us to the breaking point." "Then we engage them," the Aelkai representative suggested, their voice sharp, almost eager. "Test them, find their limits. If they truly won't abide by the laws of the Federation, then we'll make an example of them. We can't allow a rogue species to undermine the stability of the entire galaxy." There was a nervous tension in the room now. The council members knew that the situation was precarious. Any move they made could either ensure the survival of the Federation's peace or ignite a conflict that would fracture everything they had worked so hard to build. But one thing was certain. Something had to be done. Zarva took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We'll need to proceed carefully, but we cannot let this stand. Humanity must be brought to heel, one way or another. If we allow them to continue unchecked, we risk everything we've built." And so the stage was set. The Federation had underestimated humanity, and now they were faced with a species that refused to be controlled by their laws. The seeds of conflict had been planted, and no one, Not even the Federation could see how it would end. But one thing was clear: the galaxy would never be the same again. The decision to confront humanity had been made. The Federation was no longer willing to tolerate the unknown threat that the human species represented, but they weren't foolish enough to believe that a direct assault would be wise. The Federation had been around for millennia, and they had learned that subtlety often proved more effective than brute force. It wasn't about starting an outright war, at least not yet. It was about testing humanity, probing their boundaries, finding where their limits lay. The Federation had one advantage: the sheer scale of their influence. If they could control the flow of information, suppress humanity's efforts, and slowly encroach on their autonomy, they might still be able to bend humanity to their will. A covert operation was launched, a clandestine task force made up of Federation agents and select military units, tasked with gathering intelligence on the human military, their capabilities, and their societal structure. The goal wasn't to destroy humanity. It was to understand them, to learn how they fought, how they thought, and how they could be manipulated. The Federation had long been masters of espionage, and now they were putting those skills to the test on a much grander scale. If they could break humanity's will without firing a single shot, they would be able to ensure the galaxy's peace. Meanwhile, on Earth, reaffirm the Federation's authority. Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer had been keeping an eye on the Federation's movements. The humans had known for some time that the Federation would not be content to simply accept their presence without some kind of resistance. They had anticipated pushback, but not on this scale. Earth's leaders had already begun to strengthen their defenses, quietly preparing for a confrontation they hoped would never come. Mercer himself had been in contact with Earth's military command, urging them to prepare for a scenario where their very existence could be threatened. Mercer, however, wasn't the kind of man to sit back and wait for something to happen. He knew that the Federation would be trying to find a way to undermine humanity's autonomy, and that the covert operations were just the beginning. He had lived through too many conflicts to not recognize the signs. He had seen the ways in which the Federation operated, the subtle manipulations they were capable of. Humanity, in all its brilliance and flaws, had already survived the brutality of war. He began to assemble a group of human operatives, a mix of military veterans, intelligence officers, and a handful of diplomats who understood the stakes. The goal wasn't just to fight back against Federation interference. It was to show the Federation that humanity had learned the hardest lesson of all. They had been forged in the fires of their own wars, and now they could fight on a level that the Federation hadn't even begun to comprehend. Mercer was not about to let the Federation operate from the shadows. They had underestimated him, and they had underestimated humanity as a whole. He would ensure that the Federation's covert operations would be exposed before they could gain any traction, turning the tables and forcing them into the open. As the human operatives gathered intelligence, worked with covert communication lines, and planned for every possible outcome, Mercer's message to the Federation was simple. The game was on, and the rules had changed. The Federation had expected humanity to quietly accept their place in the galaxy. Instead, they were about to discover that humans were not the easily manipulated pawns they had assumed. They were a force to be reckoned with, a species that would not be cowed, a species that had learned the value of strength not just in battle, but in diplomacy, in tactics, and in the power of their own will. As Mercer continued to prepare his forces, he also began to spread word to other humans who had been living on the fringes of Federation space, on worlds where the influence of the great powers had not yet fully reached. These humans had their own struggles, their own conflicts, and they too would have to be ready for what was coming. Mercer's vision was not just for Earth, but for humanity as a whole, to show the Federation that the human race could not and would not be controlled by the whims of any power. the galaxy would tremble, not at the sight of Federation warships, but at the undeniable force that was humanity. The first phase of the Federation's covert operation was already underway. As expected, they had chosen to target Earth's vulnerable infrastructure, communications, trade routes, and the emerging military technologies that had begun to catch their eye. But what they hadn't counted on was the growing network of human intelligence, coordinated across multiple fronts. The Federation's efforts would not go unchallenged. Mercer had seen this before. Every war, every invasion, every time a species had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead, but he also knew one thing for certain: humanity had always found a way to fight back, and this time, it wasn't going to be any different. The Federation might think they were in control, but in the coming months, they would learn what it meant to face an enemy that refused to surrender, one that would fight to the bitter end, whatever the cost. The true test had only just begun. The tension had been building for weeks, a palpable weight that hung over the galaxy like a storm on the horizon. The Federation's covert operations had slowly begun to take effect, but they were far from the overwhelming success they had hoped for. Humanity, far from being the helpless, compliant species they had assumed, had begun to fight back in ways no one could have predicted. What started as subtle resistance had escalated into something far more coordinated, more dangerous than the Federation had ever imagined. Lieutenant Colonel John Mercer, the architect of humanity's response, had been at the heart of the resistance effort. His operations were not just military, they were psychological, strategic, and, above all, insidious. Mercer had always understood one fundamental truth: the Federation, for all its power, was vulnerable to the same things that had almost torn humanity apart in its own past: arrogance, underestimation, and complacency. The Federation had expected humanity to fold in the face of their superior technology and overwhelming resources. They had thought that humanity's history of conflict would make them easy to manipulate, a species conditioned by war to fall in line. But humanity had a strength the Federation could never anticipate: their refusal to be subjugated, their capacity to learn from the past, and most of all, their relentless drive to protect their own. As the Federation's subtle incursions into Earth's infrastructure grew bolder, humans had responded with precision. Mercer's team had infiltrated Federation communication networks, siphoning intelligence and destabilizing their operations. Every Federation move was met with a countermeasure. Every tactic, every covert action, was flipped back on its head. It wasn't just Earth that had begun to resist. Human colonies scattered across distant star systems had rallied together in a way the Federation had never seen before. The once fragmented human settlements, each struggling with their own issues, had found unity in the face of a common threat. No longer isolated, they shared information, coordinated efforts, and bolstered each other's defenses. The Federation, ever reliant on its technological superiority, found itself facing an enemy that adapted faster than they could react, a species that thought outside the rigid confines of logic and diplomacy they had so carefully constructed, coordinating operations, forging alliances with other species who had grown wary of the Federation's overreach. The whispers of revolt that had begun as quiet murmurs in the back rooms of the galactic underworld were now a full-fledged uprising. The Federation, which had once looked down on humanity as a primitive species, was now confronted by a force that had learned to fight in ways that were impossible to predict. Yet, despite their initial successes, Mercer knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The Federation would not back down easily. They had vast resources, a unified military, and decades of experience in dealing with less scrappy, less dangerous species. The first phases of resistance had been about proving humanity's strength, showing the Federation that they were not the easy target they had imagined, but the real battle of power within the Federation that would decide the fate of humanity and the galaxy. The Federation's military leaders had begun to report that their covert operations were unraveling. Attempts to sabotage human military advancements had failed. The intelligence they had gathered had been compromised. The Federation was facing a species that refused to bow to their might, a species that fought not just with weapons, but with ingenuity, with a fierce determination that was both terrifying and impressive. Jarva, still the Federation's chief diplomat, found himself at the center of a crisis. The peaceful vision of the Federation, the lofty ideals of galactic unity, were beginning to fracture. In hushed meetings with his colleagues, he argued that humanity's resistance had gone far beyond what they had initially anticipated. They are not just surviving, he said to a group of his fellow diplomats. They are thriving, and they are uniting. The more we try to control them, the stronger they become. Zarva's concerns were met with resistance from some quarters, particularly from those who still believed that the Federation's technological and diplomatic superiority could overcome any obstacle. But the whispers of doubt were growing louder. The Federation had encountered many species in its long history, but none had fought back so fiercely, so relentlessly. Mercer, for his part, had been preparing for the inevitable escalation. He knew that the Federation would not back down. They would send fleets, launch strikes, and impose even stricter sanctions. But Mercer had one thing they didn't: the will of a species that had endured more than its fair share of suffering. Humanity had been forged in the flames of conflict, and now, with the stakes higher than ever, they were ready to prove that they could rise above it, not just for survival, but for their freedom. The Federation, for all its wisdom and technological might, had underestimated humanity in the worst way possible. They had assumed that they could control the humans. They had assumed that their laws, their peace, would be enough to bend humanity to their will. But as the conflict escalated, one thing became clear. This was not a battle between two species. It was a battle for the very soul of the galaxy.
Yeah.
And humanity had no intention of losing.